All right, so today we're going to be looking at some really interesting stuff about what's happening with U.S. policy in Ukraine. It's definitely getting complicated.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah.
And specifically, we're going to try and focus on three things: the financial aid that the U.S. has been sending over there, the ATCMS missiles that everybody's been talking about,
Yeah.
and then this decision about sending over anti-personnel mines, which is causing a lot of controversy.
Well, that's a big one for sure.
And, we've got a change in administration coming up pretty soon, too, with President-elect Trump about ready to take over. It's like adding a whole other layer of uncertainty to all of this.
Yeah, you've got these existing tensions, and then on top of that, you've got this question of what's going to change once there's somebody new in the White House. It's a really fascinating time to be looking at all of this.
And to help us unpack all this, we've got three sources that we're going to be looking at today. We've got a piece from Reuters that's looking at the Biden administration's decision to forgive billions of dollars in loans to Ukraine. We've got an Al Jazeera article that's diving deep into what it means for Ukraine to use those U.S. missiles inside of Russia for the first time. And then we've got Fox News, which is covering Biden's decision to approve sending those anti-personnel mines over there, which, like I said, it's causing a lot of debate.
You've got some people saying this is a necessary step, that we need to take to support Ukraine. And you've got other folks saying, whoa, this could be really dangerous. This could escalate things in a way that we don't want.
Right.
And it's all happening, right, as, we're about to have this change in leadership. So it just adds a whole other level of, well, what does this mean for the future of this conflict? What does this mean for U.S. involvement? It's just a lot to unpack.
And it's something that I think a lot of our listeners are going to be interested in. I think the best place to start is with that loan forgiveness. Because, money talks, right? Biden's administration is making a move to forgive these loans, roughly $4.7 billion that the U.S. gave to Ukraine. On the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward way to help them out, right? Like, okay, here's some money, you don't have to pay it back.
It might seem like that at first glance, but it's really important to understand the background here. This loan forgiveness is something that was set up in a congressional funding bill back in April.
Yeah.
That bill set aside over $9.4 billion in loans that were designed to be forgiven. So this isn't a brand new thing that Biden's just doing.
This was already in the works.
Exactly.
So even though this is sort of like, it's been planned for a little bit, what could still stop this from happening?
Even though that bill was passed and set things in motion, Congress still has the power to say no to the actual forgiveness of the loans.
Oh, really? So they could just be like, nope, not doing that.
And there's already some people speaking out against it. Senator Rand Paul's been one of the loudest voices saying he doesn't think this is a good idea.
I feel like things are starting to get interesting here. It seems like President Biden is really trying to push this through quickly before President-elect Trump takes office.
Yeah.
There's this urgency to it.
You've got this sense that they're trying to get things locked in before things potentially change. President-elect Trump has said a lot about how he thinks he can end this conflict quickly, and he's made statements in the past that suggest he might have a very different approach to the U.S.'s involvement in Ukraine. So the Biden administration is kind of looking ahead and thinking, okay, if things are going to change, we want to try to get certain things in place before that happens.
So we've got all of this financial stuff happening, this move to forgive these loans, and then you've also got this looming change in the administration.
Yeah.
But then you've also got this whole situation with the U.S. missiles being used inside of Russia for the first time.
That's huge.
These are the ATACMS missiles.
I know. Yeah, the Army Tactical Missile System, or ATCMS for short. And the thing about these is they're long range.
Okay.
They're surface-to-surface missiles, so they can hit targets over 180 miles away.
Wow.
And the big deal here is that Ukraine has never used them inside of Russia.
That's a big escalation.
That's why this is making big news.
What are the experts saying? Why would the U.S. allow this, especially now when things are already so tense?
There are a few different theories going around.
Okay.
One idea is that it's a way to send a strong message to North Korea.
Interesting.
Because there have been concerns that North Korea might send more troops to help Russia. And so by allowing Ukraine to use these missiles, it's kind of like saying, hey, don't even think of getting involved because things could escalate really quickly.
It's a warning shot.
Exactly.
So even though these missiles are being used in the conflict with Russia, there's this out to other countries who...
You have to think about all the different players involved and how every action can have these unintended consequences or these effects on other countries that aren't even directly involved in the conflict.
It's a giant chessboard.
It really is.
What else are the experts saying about why the U.S. might have made this decision?
Another theory is that by letting Ukraine use these missiles, It strengthens their position if there are any peace negotiations in the future.
It's like giving them more leverage.
It shows that they're not backing down, that they have the ability to strike back, and that makes them a much more formidable opponent at the negotiating table.
It's kind of like speak softly, but carry a big stick.
Yeah, exactly.
We've got deterring North Korea. We've got strengthening Ukraine's hand in negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else going on here?
You also have to consider what's happening on the ground. The situation on the battlefield is constantly changing. It could be that this decision is really just a direct response to some new challenge that Ukraine is facing. Maybe they need to target Russian infrastructure or supply lines that are further away.
I see.
These missiles give them the ability to do that.
So it's like you've got the political side of things here in the U.S., you've got the potential involvement of other countries, and then you've got what's actually happening on the ground. And all of these things are intertwined.
Exactly, and they're all influencing each other. It's this complex web of factors, and it's hard to say how it's all going to play out.
Yet you've got all these different factors playing into each other.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to predict what's going to happen.
And to make things even more complicated, you've got all these different opinions about what the consequences of all this might be. Some folks, and particularly those that are aligned with President-elect Trump, they're raising concerns about the potential for this to escalate into something much bigger.
Like a larger conflict.
And they're even using terms like World War III and painting a pretty bleak picture.
So there's this real fear that this could spiral out of control.
Exactly.
So there's this side that's really worried about this.
Mm-hmm.
But is there another side to this as well?
There are other experts who see this very differently. Like Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution sees this as in line with how President Biden has handled things. He's been very cautious. He's weighed every decision very carefully. Even though this is a significant move, they don't think it's a complete departure from his overall strategy.
Rather than this reckless move towards a larger conflict, this could be seen as a carefully considered risk. Like, okay, we're going to push back against Russia, but we're going to do it in a way that doesn't completely upset the balance of power.
Exactly. It's like walking a tightrope.
And it kind of leads to this big question of what happens if this backfires?
Yeah.
Could this actually make Russia more aggressive?
Yeah, that's the big unknown, and it's something we have to think about. And on top of that, we also have this news about President Biden sending anti-personnel mines over to Ukraine,
Right.
which is another decision that's causing a lot of people to worry about escalation and unintended consequences.
Yeah, so you've got these mines, and that's definitely a big shift because the U.S. has had this policy against using them for a long time.
Right.
And now Biden's reversed that decision.
It's a big change.
Why is this such a controversial decision? What makes these mines so problematic?
These mines have a really bad reputation.
Yeah.
They're indiscriminate, so that means that they can hurt anyone who comes into contact with them.
Oh, wow.
It doesn't matter if it's a soldier or a civilian.
It's like it doesn't distinguish between who it's hurting.
Exactly. And what's even more disturbing is that these mines can stay active for years, even decades after a conflict is over.
So long after the fighting has stopped, they could still be hurting people.
So it's this lingering danger for anyone who's living in that area.
It's like this long-term legacy of harm.
That's exactly what people are worried about. And that's why this decision by President Biden is making so many people nervous. It's like crossing a line for some folks.
Well,
it's
yeah.
like resorting to a kind of warfare that many consider to be totally unacceptable.
But it's not like the administration is completely ignoring these concerns.
Right.
The Fox News report mentioned that they're sending over these mines with battery-powered fuses, so that means they have a limited lifespan. They're not going to be active forever.
It's an attempt to address the problem that these mines can last for so long.
Right.
But even with a limited lifespan, the potential for them to cause harm is still very real.
It's an attempt to reduce the risk, but it doesn't eliminate it completely.
And the timing of it is really interesting, too, because you've got this decision happening at the same time that Ukraine is using those ATACMS missiles inside of Russia, and Russia just updated their nuclear doctrine. So all of these things are happening at once, and it's definitely creating this sense of unease, like things are getting out of control.
It feels like everything's happening so fast.
Yeah, it feels like every time one side does something, the other side responds, and it just keeps escalating.
Back and forth.
Exactly, and you can already see the blame game starting. The Fox News report talks about how Trump and his allies are saying that Biden is pushing us toward a global conflict.
They're pointing the finger directly at Biden.
They're saying that his decisions are reckless and dangerous, and that he's putting the whole world at risk.
So they're saying he's responsible for this escalation.
Exactly.
It's a very complex situation with a lot of history.
And I think it's important to remember that it's not as simple as saying one side is right and the other side is wrong.
It's never that simple.
It's more nuanced than that.
How do you begin to make sense of this when every decision could backfire and everything is so uncertain?
I think it's tempting to get caught up in the blame game, to try to figure out whose fault it is.
Right.
I think the more important question is, how do we move forward in a way that minimizes the harm and gives us the best chance of finding a peaceful solution?
It's easy to get stuck in the past,
Mm-hmm.
but we have to figure out how to move forward.
That's where things get really tricky because there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
There's no map for dealing with something this complex.
There's a lot at stake.
Absolutely.
We've got these big policy decisions happening, a new president about to take office, and a lot of tension and uncertainty in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we even begin to understand all of this?
Well, I think it starts with remembering that this isn't just about politics and military strategy. This is about real people whose lives are being affected by these decisions.
It's easy to lose sight of that when you're talking about abstract concepts like policy or power.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, this is about human beings.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we often forget in these kinds of discussions. We need to remember that there are human stories at the heart of this conflict, stories of loss and resilience and hope and despair.
It's a reminder that behind all the headlines and political maneuvering, there are real people who are trying to navigate this incredibly difficult situation.
And that's a great segue to something we wanted to highlight today.
Okay.
Something that speaks to the importance of human connection and understanding, even when there's conflict and division.
Yeah.
You're talking about the Standing in the Gaps podcast, right?
I've heard good things about them.
They're doing amazing work to bring people together and help them understand each other better. Their whole idea is to bring people together from different backgrounds, different beliefs, people who might not normally talk to each other, and have them have these open and honest conversations.
It's creating a space where people can listen to each other
Exactly.
instead of staying in their own little bubbles.
And it's not just about talking. They're actively trying to break down stereotypes and challenge those preconceived notions to show that even when we think we're really different, there's often a lot of common ground.
It's a powerful reminder that connection is possible,
Absolutely.
even when things seem divided.
They're running a GoFundMe campaign right now to help them reach more people and have a bigger impact.
That's great.
We thought this would be a good opportunity to share their work with our listeners.
We'll include a link in the show notes, so if anyone wants to check them out and support their work, they can.
It's a great example of how, even with all the chaos and uncertainty in the world, there are people out there who are trying to build bridges and create a more peaceful and compassionate world.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to see. It's a reminder that even small acts of connection and empathy can make a difference.
And that's where real change starts.
We've got all these big policy decisions happening.
Yeah.
What are the potential consequences of these actions?
And how are those consequences going to be influenced by the changing political landscape here in the U.S.? The Fox News report mentioned that Great Britain and France gave Ukraine the okay to use their own long-range missiles inside of Russia, too. They've got the SITG and the Storm Shadow missiles.
So it's not just a U.S. thing.
It seems like a lot of Western countries are coming together and saying, okay, we're going to give Ukraine these more advanced weapons, even though there are some serious risks involved.
But does that make things safer? Or does it just provoke Russia even more?
That's the question, isn't it? It's such a tricky situation.
Yeah.
You want to show Russia that we're united and that we're serious about supporting Ukraine, but you also don't want to make them feel like they're being threatened.
Right, because that could lead to even more problems.
Exactly.
And it's not just about Russia either. We have to think about how this looks to other countries who might be thinking about getting involved.
Absolutely.
Does this show of force by the West make them more cautious, or does it make them more likely to pick a side?
It's hard to say.
There's just so much to consider.
It's a really complicated geopolitical landscape, and in the middle of all of this, it's easy to forget about the people who are actually being affected by this war.
That's a really important point.
While we're talking about policy and strategy, there are real people on the ground whose lives are being turned upside down.
That Fox News report mentioned that President Zelensky did an interview with Bret Baier to talk about what's happening in Ukraine. And it brought it home for me how important it is to hear from the people who are actually living through this.
Absolutely.
You know, their voices often get lost in all the political analysis and the discussions about strategy, but their experiences, their stories, their hopes and fears, That's what really matters. That's what reminds us what's at stake here and why it's so important to find a peaceful resolution.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the potential consequences of these policy changes, but what about the reasons behind them? Why is the Biden administration making these moves, especially knowing that President-elect Trump is about to take over?
That's a great question, and there's really no easy answer. Some people think that Biden is truly committed to helping Ukraine and making sure they have what they need to defend themselves against Russia. They see
Yeah.
it as a matter of principle,
So doing the right thing.
standing up for democracy and self-determination.
And then there are others who are more skeptical,
Right.
who see this as Biden trying to solidify his legacy on the world stage before he leaves office. Like a way of saying, this is what I stand for, this is what America stands for, even if it means taking some risks.
Yeah.
And I imagine it's probably a combination of factors:
Sure.
personal convictions, political calculations, a sense of responsibility to uphold international norms and alliances.
It's all mixed together.
It's not a simple situation.
You also can't ignore the influence of the military-industrial complex. They have a lot to gain from continued conflict and from selling weapons.
They benefit from this in a way most people don't.
It's a sobering thought that some people are making money from this war while others are paying the ultimate price.
It makes you wonder if peace is even possible when there are so many powerful forces that benefit from the status quo.
It's a valid question.
We can't just give up and say it's too complicated. There's nothing we can do.
Absolutely not.
We have to believe that there's a way out of this, even if we don't know what it looks like.
I agree.
How do we start?
I think the first step is to acknowledge that this isn't a simple situation.
Right.
It's not a case of good guys versus bad guys.
There are gray areas.
There are legitimate concerns on all sides, and any solution that's going to work needs to address those concerns.
It has to start with a genuine desire for peace
Absolutely.
and a willingness to listen to each other and try to understand where the other side is coming from, even if we don't agree with them.
And that's where groups like Standing the Gaps are so important, because they're creating spaces for those difficult conversations to happen.
They're helping people connect on a human level.
Exactly. To build empathy and understanding.
We need more of that in the world.
Absolutely.
We need more spaces where people can talk to each other authentically, without judgment and with a genuine desire to learn and grow.
It's not easy work, and it doesn't always produce immediate results, but it's the kind of work that creates the foundation for lasting peace.
It's about laying the groundwork.
Exactly.
So we've talked about the different perspectives on the conflict and the reasons behind these policy changes and how important dialogue and empathy are. But what would it actually look like to resolve this peacefully?
Would it involve territorial concessions, security guarantees, international peacekeeping forces?
It seems like there are so many pieces to this puzzle.
Any solution would have to address the root causes of the conflict.
And those causes are deep-seated. You've got historical grievances and mistrust between nations and competition for resources.
Right. These are issues that have been building for a long time.
It's not going to be fixed overnight.
There have been atrocities committed on both sides, and any lasting peace would have to include justice and reconciliation.
It's a lot to take on.
It is.
We can't just throw our hands up and say it's impossible, can we?
Even the most difficult conflicts can be resolved. It just takes time, patience, and a willingness to compromise.
And a commitment to understanding each other's perspectives.
Exactly. Finding that common ground.
It takes people who are willing to stand up and say, we need a different way forward. We need to prioritize peace and human dignity over violence and division.
Right. And that's where we all have a role to play. It's not just up to the politicians and diplomats to find a solution. We can all contribute to building a more peaceful world in our own ways by supporting organizations like Standing in the Gaps, by having those tough conversations with people who see things differently than we do, by choosing compassion over judgment and refusing to give up on the possibility of a better future.
Those are all powerful things that can have a ripple effect and create positive change that goes way beyond ourselves.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by how complicated and serious this is.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that even small acts of kindness and understanding can make a difference.
And together we can create a more peaceful and just world.
One conversation, one act of compassion at a time.
We've been focusing a lot on the U.S. perspective, but we also need to think about how this is being seen in other parts of the world.
Right.
The Al Jazeera article talked about the global reactions to the U.S. missiles being used in Russia.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because those reactions are all over the place. Some countries are really worried that this is going to lead to a bigger war.
They see it as a dangerous escalation.
And others think it's justified.
Yeah, they see it as a necessary response.
It shows how differently people are viewing this conflict and how challenging it is to figure out how to move forward.
There's no easy answer.
It underscores how important open dialogue and diplomacy are.
Absolutely.
If you avoid misunderstandings and escalation, we have to be talking to each other, listening to each other, and trying to see things from each other's point of view. That's where individual acts of empathy and understanding come in.
It's not just about governments and international organizations working together.
It's about people connecting with each other.
It's about breaking down those stereotypes and building bridges of communication.
That brings us back to Standing in the Gaps and their GoFundMe campaign. It's inspiring to see people working to promote understanding and bridge divides, even with all this global tension.
They're a great reminder that even small acts of kindness and communication can make a difference.
Cultivating empathy and connection is crucial, especially in times of conflict and division.
We can get so caught up in the big picture, the political maneuvering and the global power dynamics, but it's the human stories, the individual acts of courage and compassion that really shape the course of history.
And those stories are the ones that give us hope and inspire us to work for a more peaceful and just world.
Absolutely.
We've talked about different perspectives on this conflict and the potential consequences of these recent policy decisions, and we've talked about how important dialogue and empathy are. But the big question is, what happens next?
What does the future hold for Ukraine, for the U.S.'s involvement, and for the possibility of peace? That's what everyone wants to know, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The situation is constantly changing. There are so many factors at play. The outcome of the election here in the U.S., the level of support from our allies, what's happening internally in both Ukraine and Russia, all of these things are going to influence what happens in the coming months and years.
It's like this giant game of chess where the players and the rules keep changing. The stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely.
We're talking about global stability and lives.
And in this game, there are no guarantees. Every move has risks and potential consequences, and the path forward is full of uncertainty.
How do we deal with that uncertainty?
I think it starts with staying informed and engaging in thoughtful analysis.
Okay.
And being willing to question our own assumptions and biases.
Being open to different perspectives.
Exactly. And recognizing that this is a complex situation and avoiding those easy narratives that try to oversimplify it.
Right.
Not black and white.
And even with all this uncertainty and complexity, we can't lose hope.
Right.
We have to keep working towards a better future.
We can't let the challenges stop us from taking action. Every act of kindness, every conversation that helps people understand each other, every effort to build bridges of empathy, those are all steps in the right direction.
So let's hold on to that hope. Let's keep asking those tough questions. Let's keep having those difficult conversations.
Absolutely.
Let's keep working towards a world where peace and human dignity are the priority.
Beautifully said. It's easy to get bogged down in all the negativity, but I really believe that a better future is possible.
Yeah.
It just requires us to stay committed to those values of peace and compassion.
Great reminder.
And it's a perfect transition to the last part of our deep dive, where we'll explore what a peaceful resolution to this conflict could look like. So we've talked about all this potential for things to escalate even further, and this delicate balance, trying to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself, but also making sure that this doesn't turn into a larger war.
Yeah.
And we've talked about, the people whose lives are being directly impacted by this war. But there's one more thing we need to talk about, and that's what role President-elect Trump might play in all of this.
Yeah, we can't forget that there's about to be a change in leadership in the U.S.
Yeah.
And Trump has made some pretty big promises about how he's going to fix things in Ukraine.
He said that he thinks he can end the conflict before he even takes office.
That's a bold statement.
It definitely got people's attention, both here and in other countries. Everyone's wondering, okay, what would a Trump presidency actually mean for U.S. policy towards Ukraine?
Would he try to negotiate directly with Putin? Would he cut back on the military aid that we're sending to Ukraine?
Yeah.
Or stop it altogether?
And how would Russia react to that? What about our allies? What about the Ukrainian people?
It's like there are all these question marks hanging over everything right now.
Yeah. It adds a whole other level of uncertainty on top of what's already a very unpredictable situation. And we've seen President-elect Trump take a very different approach to foreign policy in the past, so it's hard to know exactly what he'll do this time.
It feels like we're standing at this crossroads with all these different paths in front of us. And no one knows which path will lead to peace
We've talked about the risks of doing too much, of potentially escalating things. But what about the risks of not doing enough? What happens if the U.S. and its allies don't give Ukraine enough support?
That's a good question. It seems like everyone's so focused on avoiding a larger conflict that they might not be thinking enough about what happens if we don't do enough to help Ukraine.
And it could send a really dangerous message to Russia. It could make them think that they can get away with anything, that the international community isn't going to stand up to them.
And it's not just about Russia either. It could embolden other authoritarian leaders around the world.
If they see that Russia's getting away with this, they might be more likely to use force to get what they want.
We want to prevent things from escalating, but we also can't just sit back and watch while Russia breaks international law and changes borders by force.
It's a real dilemma.
There are no easy answers.
You have to think about all the possible outcomes, both the ones that might happen right away and the ones that might happen years down the road.
You have to acknowledge that there are different viewpoints on this issue,
Mm-hmm.
both here in the U.S. and around the world.
Those viewpoints are influenced by so many things, by people's personal histories, by their ideologies, by their experiences.
It's easy to try to simplify everything and see it as good versus evil,
Right.
but it's more complicated than that.
So while it's important to condemn what Russia's doing and to support Ukraine's right to exist as an independent country, we also have to be realistic about how complex this situation is and make sure we're not choosing solutions that could make things even worse.
I think the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged,
Absolutely.
and to be willing to have these tough conversations about these really challenging issues. We can't just ignore it and hope that it goes away.
The choices we make now are going to shape the world we live in.
They really are.
And those choices need to be guided by our values, compassion, and commitment to peace and justice.
It's been a really intense conversation, a lot to think about.
It really has.
But even with all this uncertainty and complexity, I keep thinking about how powerful human connection can be.
We've talked about governments and international organizations and military strategy and all these political calculations. But at the end of the day, it's those connections between people, the acts of kindness and empathy, the willingness to listen to each other that gives me hope.
And those connections can happen anywhere.
Absolutely.
It can be talking to a friend who sees things differently than you do. It can be supporting an organization that's working for peace. It can be just that moment when you connect with someone from a different background and you realize that you have more in common than you thought.
Those moments might seem small, but they can have a ripple effect.
They can create real change in the world.
Let's choose hope instead of despair. Let's choose compassion instead of judgment.
And connection instead of division.
And let's keep working towards a future where peace is the reality everywhere, not just in Ukraine.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into U.S. policy in Ukraine.
We hope this has given you some new insights and encouraged you to keep thinking about these important issues.
If you're looking for a way to make a difference, check out the Standing in the Gaps podcast and their GoFundMe campaign.
They're doing amazing work to bring people together and promote understanding and empathy.
They're proof that even in the darkest times, there's still hope and that we can create something beautiful together.
Thanks for listening, and stay curious.